Hello, I'm Steve, and welcome to Exploring History with a guy named Steve. That's me. Never know what to say. How do you start these things? Rome, basically. And welcome to the first episode of what I hope will be a ongoing series exploring the parts of history that I find the most interesting. And it's a lot, trust me, it goes on. And there's always new stuff. But today I thought I'd talk about something that I find particularly interesting, which is the end of the Roman Republic. It's a very, very interesting period. There's so much going on, and I know that no matter how hard I try today, I will not be able to cover all of it. Probably won't even be able to cover anything close to all of it, and I probably won't even cover what I'm talking about today very well at all. But hopefully I can give you roughly a gist of one particular aspect that not many people know about, which is what I really want to kind of do, sort of introduce these aspects of history that people aren't entirely aware of, but probably should be, because they're kind of interesting. So what I wanted to talk about today was the Triumvirate. There were two of them. It had a first one and a sequel, the second Triumvirate, which was a bit like Shrek, actually. The second one's pretty damn good, almost as good as the first one, in fact. So, the best way to start this is to firstly discuss exactly what a triumvirate is. Now, broadly speaking, it's a political system ruled by three people. Three people, not three. These people are known as triumvirs, which is obviously where the name triumvirate comes from. This idea of a triumvirate has been used many times by history, but the first real use of it was in this Roman period of the first and second triumvirate in the very late Republic. There were two major triumvirates throughout Roman history, as I've said, and they are known as the first and the second. While on paper these seem to be very similar, there were several key differences that really set the first and second triumvirate apart by quite a margin. These differences mainly occurring in their creation, execution, and eventual dissolution, both of which happened in fairly spectacular fashions, especially for the Roman period. However, both of them did have important roles in bringing about the end of the Republic. They were both inherently intertwined in this end of the Roman Republic going forward into the imperial era, the beginning of the Principate, which was the first part of Roman imperial rule. The first triumvirate was formed by Julius Caesar, Marcus Crassus, and Pompey Magnus, three of probably the biggest players in Roman politics at the time. It serves a very particular purpose, but the key thing to remember is that it had no legal status whatsoever. It was merely an informal alliance. Now, in the modern day, it's easy to look back and say that informal, formal, is there really any big difference? Especially when you go back that far, and the answer is yes. The Roman political machine was very complex, very bureaucratic, and I think today it's very easy to forget just how bureaucratic these things were, with the positions of power you could get into, and the length of your terms and your supporters and political parties. It was pretty damn muddy, I think is the best way to describe it. In effect, it was a boys' club. It was there to safeguard the political power of its three members, basically ensuring they had something of a hegemony over the Roman Senate, over the consuls, and could basically get their own way a lot easier. For maybe 30 years, either a member of the triumvirate, one of the triumvirs, Cassius, Julius Caesar, Pompey Magnus, one of them was consul, of which they all were at various points, or one of their subordinates and somebody that followed them was consul. So since 70 BC up until the death of the last Triumvir in 44 BC, there was very little time in which one or the other or a supporter was not in power pulling the strings, basically in the very centre of the bureaucracy of Rome. So why did the Triumvirate form? Well, after Pompey had come back from his campaigns, his political party, the Optimates, really felt like he had too much power. Now, it's important to remember at this point that the Romans are terrified of tyrants in particular, because they've sort of got a history with tyrants and the Roman kings. That's a whole other subject for a different video, but they do not want one man having too much power. Pompey's popularity at this point kind of eclipses theirs. Now, he is a member of the Optimates. He is very high up in the ranking of the Optimates. However, they don't want him having too much power. They don't want him running the show. And it's safe to say he had something of a bias towards the Roman army, being a military man. So I think the most famous example of them butting heads was Pompey wanted to pass some reforms to distribute grain more evenly to the soldiers, give the soldiers some land, because at this point they were living on a grain dole, and that's not really how he saw the mighty guardians of Rome living. He wanted them to have much better lives, which is understandable. But of course, the Optimates didn't quite see it that way. They were a far more conservative faction. They were much less concerned about things like that, and more with temples and things like that. Broadly speaking, that is a gross oversimplification, but for the purposes of this, let's just assume they're not really on the same page. This is, of course, a point where Pompey isn't one of the two consuls. There were obviously two consuls. We won't go into the political makeup of Rome now. That's for a whole nother video. It's too complicated, and frankly, I don't know enough about it yet. However, I do know there are two consuls, one of whom was a guy named Afrianus. Now, Afrianus was a supporter of Pompey, but he was a little bit ineffective, and Pompey was constantly frustrated by Afrianus's inability to help him push his reforms through the Senate, especially through the Optimate faction. Now, it wasn't until 60 BC where the former governor of Hispania bursts back onto the scene. Now, you've probably heard of this guy. His name is Julius Gaius Caesar, and he's a pretty big deal. I mean, goddamn, he's Julius Caesar. He comes back from Hispania, and Pompey basically says to him, "You want to be my friend? We can be friends." It's also important to remember that Julius Caesar is not an Optimate. He's a Popularis, which is the opposing faction in the Roman Senate. Nobody really liked this. They weren't really a fan of this. Julius Caesar agreed, and between them, they now had double the clout in the Roman Senate. They bickered all the time, but for the intents and purposes of political machinations, they were, very close. They were also both military men, so certainly had the interest of the army in their hearts. Now, it's at this point that Julius Caesar asks his friend Marcus Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome. Now, this guy's wealth is unimaginable. He asks him to join their little club, or fledgling triumvirate as it is at this point, and he agrees. Now, it's also important to remember at this point, Marcus Crassus is a very old rival of Pompey's. He is very entrenched in Popularis politics, and you've got Pompey on the Optimates on the other side. They have history, but at this point they're rather willing to put aside their politics and pursue their own political agendas. Now, this is the point where faction politics is overshadowed. It's almost like there's a whole separate group of these three men being formed, pushing their own agendas. At this point, this worked fantastically. The reforms all went through, and the three of them basically had hegemony over the entire empire. They were top dogs at this point. And they also started to solidify their position. Now, Julius Caesar's daughter married Pompey, which is... yeah, there was an age difference, but for the time that was a fairly standard thing to do. Now, this went on for some years, but of course, over time, cracks had really started to show between these three major players in Roman political politics. Marcus Crassus died on campaign in 53 BC in Parthia, leaving somewhat of a power vacuum, and it crumbled even more when Julius Caesar's daughter died in childbirth. Pompey feared that Julius Caesar now had too much power, and he made efforts to curtail Caesar's influence, now there only being the two of them. The Triumvirate effectively being disbanded on the death of Marcus Crassus, and he demanded that Caesar disband his legions, come back to Rome to face trial. Now, was this a power play, or did he have a legitimate reason? Well, it's largely up to them to know, basically, where there's conflicting evidence on both sides to suggest what way round it was. I'd be inclined to be in the Caesarian camp, because I don't think at this point Caesar did have any real designs on becoming any form of dictator. But however, the Senate at this point fully supported Pompey. Caesar and his 13th Legion then crossed the Rubicon, both metaphorically and literally, and marched straight into Rome with the 13th Legion. Pompey and most of the Senate fled, effectively leaving Julius Caesar in sole power. This also started a civil war between the Pompeian faction and the Caesarian faction. And that is another topic for a whole nother video, but to sum it down, Caesar won, rather convincingly. Pompey was then murdered in Egypt, and not too long later, so was Caesar. The assassination of Caesar is, again, another topic for a whole nother video, but we all basically know what happened. He was stabbed many, many times by the people he thought he could trust. This, while it didn't entirely topple the Republic, left it severely unstable and in a rather uncertain state, which, as you'll come to see, leaves the door wide open for these very strong other characters to come in and basically assume control in the big void that's been left by the death in a fairly short period of these three major players in Roman politics. Stability, as I said, is a very key factor in what will become the formation of the Second Triumvirate. It is the sequel and the follow-up, and occurs roughly 5 years later after the murder of Caesar. Now, it's formed between Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. These are three important figures of the time, but it's also important to remember that Mark Antony is one of Caesar's most trusted generals, Octavius is his nephew and adopted son, and Lepidus is a former rebel. His father had many years in the past attempted to rebel from the empire, and that was quelled, but that's not really important right now. But a good chunk of those who also controlled the Senate were also dead. The people that had murdered Caesar were largely disposed of, so Brutus, Cassius, Cicero, they were all pushed by the wayside, either dead, about to be dead, or would one day become dead and not have anything to do with politics at all. And of course there was a power vacuum within what happened in the tumult after Caesar's assassination. After a quick civil war within a civil war between Mark Antony and Octavian, Mark Antony was soundly beaten at the Battle of Mutina, and the peace negotiations actually brought him into alliance with Octavian, effectively doubling the amount of troops he had at his disposal. Lepidus, who was in Hispania at the time, and had been basically keeping all of that quite safe from the civil war, offered his support to the fledgling triumvirate, effectively buying himself a place in the carving up of the Republic. Now, the key difference to remember here is that the Second Triumvirate had binding legal power. It was known as the Three-Man Commission for Restoring the Constitution of the Republic. Now, that's kind of ironic. It's a little bit ironic. During which they effectively dismantled the machines of the Roman legal system. something from which the status quo had never recovered. Now, in hindsight, the only way they could possibly go from here was down. As with the lessons taught me a generation before, the cracks had started to show, and it really wasn't long until the gladii were drawn. For you see, both sides had very strong supporting factions. Mark Antony was the darling of the popularis. They adored him. And Octavian was more on the side of the Optimates, but not too heavily. Now it's at this point that the second triumvirate really starts to unravel. Octavian exiled Lepidus on charges of corruption. They stripped him of rank, his titles, and exiled him to Circe, a fair way away from Rome and Italy, and only allowed him into Rome on special occasions. To many, this was the end of the Second Triumvirate and the start of the Second Civil War, which was now inevitable between Octavian and Mark Antony. But once again, the Julii clan came out on top. Antony was soundly defeated at the Battle of Actium. Now, I know this is a gross oversimplification, but for this topic it's kind of necessary to keep on track. That will be probably covered in another video because it is fascinating. You've got Antony, Cleopatra, the whole Ptolemaic dynasty, fascinating stuff. But this effectively gave Octavian total power, bringing the last ashen vestiges of the Second Triumvirate floating down to the ground. Now, the failure of the Triumvirates and the fall of the Roman Republic is, in many times now, never really thought as a bad thing. The Pax Romana that followed, the Great Roman Peace that lasted for over 50 years, is heralded as one of the major achievements of the Roman Empire, not a failure. But again, the Triumvirates were central to this. Without the Triumvirates, there likely wouldn't have been a Pax Romana. The bureaucracy that mired down the empire would never have been overarched and discarded. But I think they're a flawed concept in the long run. On paper, they're ideal to, as I said, overarch the miring Roman bureaucracy. But as is human nature, people tend to always want to get one step ahead. And I think that really comes to the fore in a group of three people rather than a senatorial, structured political system. However, with the Triumvirate, you had less of that structure, allowing one or two people to come to the fore and eventually come to blows, as really did happen with the two Triumvirates. It's also important to remember that neither of these were formed for entirely altruistic reasons. They were formed to help consolidate power and keep power with those who held it in the first place. And these power-hungry undertones were bound to surface at some point. Had the members of each triumvirate been different, would it have changed? It's hard to say. Part of me thinks it probably wouldn't have. The whole setup was, in hindsight, never going to work. They did adapt this later on in the Tetrarchy. Now, again, whole nother topic, whole nother video, but they attempted something similar with 4 people, and that had reasonably better result. But to say it would have been any different without the Triumvirates is a hard call to make. Would the Roman Republic have controlled all of its provinces with the miring bureaucracy? Possibly, possibly not. Very hard to say. Did it do that with an emperor? Most definitely. It even expanded its borders a great deal. So I think the Triumvirates both were and weren't a success, as is most things with history. It's not really one way or the other.